Welcome back to our series entitled Be a Blessing. We're following the word bless as an acrostic, and each letter stands for an important part of what we're trying to learn to do. B stands for begin with prayer. And as Don reminded us last week, we not only begin with prayer, but we continue with prayer throughout the whole process. Remember, we need to talk to God about people before we talk to people about God. And we not only begin that way, we continue through this whole process of praying for them. The letter L, the word bless, stands for listen. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And listening to people is a way in which we communicate that we really care about them. We want to know about them. But not only does it communicate that we really care about them, but as we listen to them, we learn from very practical ways in which we can care for them. So let's give our attention now to Miss Margaret and how we can become better listeners.
Thank you so much for joining us for our second week of our Bless series. Last week, Pastor Gary and Don Beecham talked to you about prayer. Everything we do has to have the basis of prayer for it to really be effective. So did you learn your memory verse? Let's everybody get our memory verse card out for the ones who didn't learn it, and we can read it all together. So let's read 1 Timothy 2:1 out loud. First of all, then, I urge requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made in behalf of all people. So today we're going to talk about the second step of the 5 everyday ways to love our neighbors and change the world. And the second letter of bless is L, and it stands for listen. So we're going to talk about listening. Now, for it to be beneficial for all of us, we all need to be very honest with ourselves about what kind of listener we are. It might hurt a little bit, but it'll be good. Okay, now not to pick on husbands because we love husbands. But one time a wife said to her husband, "You didn't hear a word I said, did you?" And the husband thought to himself, what a weird way to start a conversation. And we can all laugh at that, but if we're in the place of the wife, it's really not real funny. And we've probably all experienced it. We've been in a situation where we poured out our heart to somebody. And, that may be something at work or a hurt that we had or something we were looking forward to, only to walk away thinking they didn't hear a word I said. So today we want to talk about ways that we can learn to be better listeners. And so I want to share with you a couple of my favorite quotes. The first one is by Henry Nouwen. To listen is very hard because it takes us so much interior stability that we no longer need to prove ourselves by speeches, arguments, statements, or declarations. True listeners no longer have an inner need to make their presence known. They're free to receive, to welcome, to accept. Listening is much more than allowing another to talk while waiting for a chance to respond. Listening is paying full attention to others and welcoming them into our very beings. The beauty of listening is that those who are being listened to start feeling accepted, start taking their words more seriously, and discovering their own true selves. Listening is a form of spiritual hospitality by which you invite strangers to become friends, to get to know their inner selves more fully, and even to dare to be silent with you. The second example of a quote that I really enjoyed comes from a 4th grade teacher. And the teacher asked her class, "What is listening?" And after a few seconds, a little girl lifted her hand and she said, "Listening is wanting to hear." And I thought that was really good. There's a big difference between listening and hearing. Hearing, we're perceiving sound, whatever the sound is. It can be a person or it can be a thing. But when we listen, we're really giving ourselves to another person. We're giving them our full attention. And actually, we're preferring them over ourselves. And in doing that, it really is an act of love when we listen to others. Most people don't listen to understand. They listen to respond. And when we do that, we're all wrapped up in our own thoughts and we're missing half of the conversation. And so we need to be careful about doing that. Proverbs 18:2 has something to say to us about that. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. Again, listening is an act of love because we're preferring another person over ourselves. And when we listen to somebody else, it can change their life. That's hard for us to comprehend, but many people don't have anyone in their life who really listens to them. So it's an act of love, and we can love our neighbors that way. Listening is one of the most beneficial tools that God has given us to help each other. To be reminded of what a good listener looks like, we can read John 4:2-42 about Jesus and the woman at the well. Despite all the differences, the moral, the gender, the cultural differences, Jesus reached out to her, and not only did he listen to her, but he spoke to her. He asked perspective questions and drew her into the conversation. And guys, he knew all the answers to the questions. He didn't need to ask her questions. But I think he knew that listening to her would benefit her. So why should we all want to be better listeners? I think the first reason is because when someone's listened to, they're affirmed. We can read Mark 10, where Jesus was surrounded by a crowd of people, and he was on his way out of Jericho, and yet he heard a man calling out to him. And he stopped and he listened. He called Bartimaeus to him, the blind beggar, and not only did he listen to him, but he healed him. How affirming would that be, to be in a crowd of people and for Jesus to call you out and call you to him? And see, that's what happens when we actually listen to someone. We affirm them. When someone is listened to, they're actually strengthened. James Dobson has a quote I want to read to you. He says, "For some strange reason, human beings tolerate stress and pressure much more easily if at least one other person knows they're enduring it." So if we ask perceptive questions and give another person time to respond by listening, we can be that other person who can help someone be strengthened through a time of trial. Listening also helps people clarify their thoughts. Many times our thoughts they're tangled up. They're just not clear. There's not clarity there. And there are two ways that I've learned that you can untangle thoughts. One is the thoughts crossing your lips. And of course, the other one is crossing your fingertips. So through speaking and through writing or typing, thoughts become untangled. And we can be a person who will encourage someone to clarify their thoughts, by listening to them. And that's what Jesus was doing with the woman at the well. He was drawing her out. Again, it wasn't that he needed answers to the questions, but he knew what it was going to mean to her to be listened to. Listening also improves the accuracy of our response to the person who's talking to us. Proverbs 18:13 says, "One who gives an answer before he hears, it is foolishness and shame to him." And guys, I just have to be honest here, and it's sad for me to think of the times that I gave advice to someone and then realized that I had been answering questions that hadn't been asked. Because see, I hadn't really been listening. I was forming my response in my mind. And we want to avoid that, because what that does is it causes a person to feel misunderstood. And many times, then they really avoid talking with someone. Proverbs 25:11 says, "Like apples of gold in settings of silver is a word spoken in the proper time." But you see, we have to be listeners in order to speak those words in due season. So when we become good listeners, it will change every conversation we have, and it will change the people that we listen to as well. So how do we become better listeners? I've jotted down a few things that have helped me on my journey, and I'll share those with you. The first one is to read through the Gospels and take note of Jesus and how he drew people out, how he affirmed them, and how he spoke to their real needs. And you can go through Proverbs and take a highlighter and highlight every verse that teaches us something about being a good listener. Also, memorize verses. This week, our memory verse is Isaiah 54. Let me read it to you. "The Lord God has given me the tongue of disciples so that I may know how to sustain the weary one with a word. He awakens me morning by morning. He awakens my ear to listen as a disciple. As a disciple, a learner, one who seeks to understand." I want to read you a story that I read recently about a man from Australia. His name is Don Ritchie. Don Ritchie passed away in 2012, but before that, for 50 years, he lived across the street from a rock cliff at the entrance to Sydney Harbor called the Gap. While this rock cliff is famous for its views, it's also famous for another reason. Since the 1800s, people have come to this place to jump off the cliff and end their lives. There's only a small fence separating people from the edge. One person a week would commit suicide. Don said in an interview, you just got to do something to save them. It's pretty simple. And that's exactly what he did for 50 years. By official records, he saved 160 people, but people around him say it's really closer to 500 because there were so many that weren't recorded. How did he do it? What was his miracle method? Each morning as he got out of bed, he looked out his window and throughout the day kept watching to see if someone was alone and close to the edge. If he noticed this, he rushed out of his house to interact with the person. A news article described the moment this way. In those bleak moments when the lost soul stood atop the cliff wondering whether to jump, the sound of the wind and the waves were broken by a soft voice. Why don't you come and have a cup of tea with me? The stranger would ask. And when they turned to him, his smile was often their salvation. He offered them a cup of tea, a smile, but most importantly, he offered someone to not just hear them in their pain, but someone who really listened to them. I share this story with you today because I feel like it's a good picture of what we live around. I believe we have neighbors and friends who are in crisis mode. There are people who have hurts and people who are lonely and people have needs that we could meet or other people we know could meet if we knew about them, but they're not talking. And the reason I believe they're not talking is because they don't have anybody who will truly listen to them. They feel hopeless and will never say anything until someone gives them the opportunity to be heard. Since moving to my condo a few years ago, I've made it a point to try to get to know my neighbors. And I'll tell you, at first it was hard because everybody would drive in their garage, close the door, and go in their condo. They weren't outside, and I didn't have any interaction with people, but I began to pray for them. I got on the HOA board, and so I saw the names of everyone who lived there, and I started praying for them individually. Then later, we got involved with the Bless Every Home application, and I downloaded that app, and I've been using it ever since, praying for them. And I want you to know God has moved, and He has caused there to be divine appointments for me to talk with people. I learned the lady who lives across from me, her husband has been put into a memory care facility. And she's sad and she's lonely after more than 50 years of marriage. She's by herself. There's a young woman a couple of doors down from me, and she just recently had brain surgery and has some basic needs that we can meet. And she's fearful also. There's a young guy who lives farther down from me, and he's just a young guy, and he's lonely because he wants to be married and have children, but that opportunity hasn't come his way. So I'm surrounded by these people who have big needs, and I want to be a part of their life. I want to be there to listen to them when they need somebody to talk to and to pray with them and to let them see Jesus in my life. So the big action step this week is let's get out there and love our neighbors by listening to them. And let's affirm and strengthen and encourage them this week by listening to them. We can change the world if we do this, guys.